Okay, so welcome everyone to the latest Grand Challenge lecture from the Institute of Liberal Arts and Sciences. And this particular lecture is brought to you in partnership with Keel's Race Equality Lecture Series. So it's a great pleasure to invite Professor Kalwant Bhopal to deliver this afternoon's lecture. Kalwant's a good friend of ours in terms of the race equality work we've been doing at Keel, and has given a lecture a few years ago when she was able to come to Keel in person. Obviously today it's a virtual lecture, but it's still a great pleasure to invite you back to Keel, Kalwant. So Kalwant Bhopal is a Professor of Education and Social Justice and Director of the Centre for Research on Race and Education at the University of Birmingham. Kalwant's research focuses on the achievements and experiences of minority ethnic groups in education. She has conducted research on exploring discourses of identity and intersectionality, examining the lived experiences of Black and minority ethnic groups, as well as examining the marginal position of Gypsies and Travellers. Her research specifically explores how processes of racism, exclusion and marginalisation operate in predominantly white spaces, with a focus on social justice and inclusion. Her recent book, White Privilege, The Myth of a Post-Racial Society, was published by Policy Press. And she's working on a new book with Martin Myers, exploring elites, privilege and higher education, which will be published by Routledge later this year. Now, Kalwant is going to be happy to take some questions at the end of the lecture, and there is the opportunity for all of you to engage through the Q&A portal on the right-hand side of the screen. So please do join the conversation, and we'll endeavour to pose as many questions as the time will allow. So without further ado, and we are in the interest of finishing on time, we're going to just press ahead, and without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Kalwant Bhopal to introduce her lecture, which is entitled Competing Inequalities, Gender, Race and White Privilege in Higher Education Institutions in the UK. Kalwant, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Shane, and it's a huge pleasure to be presenting this lecture, and it's a shame that I can't be there in person at Keel. So what I'm going to be talking today is competing inequalities, gender, race and white privilege in higher education institutions in the UK. So let's start with policy making. So since the Race Relations Amendment Act and the Equality Act, there have been significant advances in race equality in higher education. The Race Relations Amendment Act was hugely important because it introduced the definition of institutional racism. And the Equality Act has also been important because it brought together all previous legislation into one single act. And the Equality Act is important because it includes protected characteristics, of which race is one. So universities then are required in law to have equality policies in place and to demonstrate their commitment to race equality. And the Equality Act has a public sector equality duty that all public bodies must comply with. So this is something that all institutions, including higher education institutions, have to do. So we have seen a significant increase in the numbers of students from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds in the last 10 years. However, I will note that the concept BME is problematic and is contested and of course needs to be discussed. And it's important that when we use such terms to recognise that the category BME is not homogenous and that there are differences within and between those different groups. So let's talk about gender and give you a few statistics in terms of higher education. So in terms of academic staff, almost 18% fewer women than men are on teaching and research contracts. In terms of professional staff, services staff, almost 80% of all part-time contracts are held by women. Although women do occupy 47.5% of all academic contracts, only almost 25% of all professors are women. And then men make up 37.4% of all professional services staff, but yet 45.9% of the most senior level roles are held by men. So what this slide shows is that there are inequalities around gender, not just in terms of academic staff, but also in terms of professional services staff and which roles are held by men and which roles are held by women. So the Athena Swan Charter was launched in 2005 and it was launched as an award for the progression of women in STEM subjects: science, technology, engineering and maths. The Athena Swan Award works through 3 levels. So universities are awarded a bronze, a silver or a gold award. At the moment, there are 160 Athena Swan Charter members with 376 awards between them. So what's important about the Athena Swan is that it's not only available as a whole institutional award, but individual departments or faculties can also apply for those awards. That's why there are 766 awards, even though there are 160 members. Now, there has been significant changes, particularly in relation to medical research and funding in 2011. And when it was announced, first of all, that Athena Swan itself would be linked to biomedical funding, there was a 400% increase in the number of applications in medical schools. So the Athena Swan actually was really important and showed an increase when it was shown that it was linked to biomedical funding. In 2015, the framework itself was also expanded to include all academic subjects and also professional staff, and also included intersectionality and a gender equality focus, because previously the actual award did not include intersectionality. So since 2005, since its introduction, it has been found to be hugely effective and have impact in creating institutional change for women. And there's a huge amount of evidence to show that it has helped to progress the advancement of women in STEM subjects. However, in my work, I argue, and in my work with Henderson and Pitkin, that the main beneficiaries of the Athena Swan Charter have been white middle-class women. Now let's look at race. In terms of race, there is, in terms of the academic staff, 9.1% of teaching and research contracts are held by BME staff. 9.1% of professors are from a BME background, with a total of 100 who are black, of which 30 are women. In terms of professional services, only 5% of the most senior level staff are from a BME background. And BME professional services staff are 5% more likely than white staff to be on fixed term contracts. So what this slide shows is that there are inequalities in relation to race, not just for academic staff, but for professorial staff and indeed professional staff, and of course on the types of contracts that individuals are on. So the Race Equality Charter is much newer than the Athena Swan Charter. It was introduced in 2015 after an initial pilot in 2014. And the possible awards currently are only bronze and silver because it's still in its infancy. And it's only available at a whole institutional level, which is very different to the Athena Swan, which is also available, as I've just said, at a departmental and faculty level. It also includes both staff and students. There are currently 75 members and 17 award holders. It's too early to discuss and difficult to assess the impact of the Race Equality Charter, as there is only one published study that exists on it, which I'm going to speak about today. Although most higher education institutions who are involved in the Race Equality Charter work are also Athena Swan members and award holders, there are no published studies that have looked at the effects of managing both the charter marks together, except for the study that I will speak about today. The first project I'm going to talk about was funded by the British Academy Leverhulme Trust, and it was conducted in 2019, and we've had various publications from it since 2019. We were particularly interested in examining the impact of the charter marks on work practices and how that had impact and effect. We wanted to look at good practice and how it could be improved, so identify pockets of good practice and use it to show how the good practice can be shared. And we wanted to identify key themes and issues for future research and policy making in higher education. So we selected 7 institutions. We particularly wanted to include a range of different higher education institutions. And for that reason, we selected post-1992, Russell Group, Million Plus and Red Brick institutions, because my own previous research has found that the type of institution has a huge impact on how equality and social justice is understood. 4 higher education institutions had at least a bronze Athena Swan Award. 3 higher education institutions were holding or working towards a bronze Race Equality Award. All of them also had a bronze Athena Swan Award, which was important, and you'll see why as I speak about the research. We conducted 10 interviews with equality, diversity and inclusion managers or individuals who are members of the self-assessment teams. The Athena Swan Charter and the Race Equality Charter includes setting up self-assessment teams who are responsible for ensuring that the data is collected and the application is submitted. We conducted 5 focus groups with self-assessment team members, and we also analysed our data by using a thematic data analysis process. The second project was funded by the UCU, the University and College Union, and that was conducted in 2018, and we did some more work on it on 2018. We were particularly interested to identify and examine aspects of good practice in Race Equality Charter in awarded higher education institutions. We also wanted to explore the views of member institutions and non-member institutions, and we felt that it was really important to make a comparison between these 3 different types of institutions in relation to the award, because again, that revealed how they approached actually and understood race and racism, and that will come out in the findings. And we wanted to contribute specifically to UCU policymaking and future strategy on race equality in higher education institutions in the UK. We conducted 45 interviews, and again, we made sure that we looked at different higher education institutions because, of course, as I've just said, that there is evidence to suggest that different institutions view race differently, different types of institutions. So we had the Russell Group, post-1992, and also non-affiliated institutions. We gained access through identifying participants through institution web pages and also sharing information about the study and invitations for individuals to participate. And we also, again, analysed our data by using a thematic process of analysis. So let's look at the findings. So the first thing we wanted to look at was how charter marks enabled positive change. And we found that both the Athena Swan and Race Equality Charter had actually provided a framework for difficult conversations and indeed a rationale for institutional change. And it was very interesting the ways in which the charter marks themselves were used to have these conversations. So many people actually said that we spoke to that previously such conversations were not had, particularly around race, whereas conversations around gender had actually been going on. But what had happened in terms of having this particular framework was that they provided a rationale to have these difficult conversations specifically around race. And consequently, we did have examples of very good practice, particularly around gender and indeed race. For instance, this included a drop-in of information sessions that individuals could visit. There were also family caring responsibilities that were taken into consideration, and also parent coaching and mentoring. So the charter marks did have positive change, and they were used to actually make a significant difference in terms of progressing gender and race and how that actually worked. So there were examples of positive change. However, there are also challenges of creating this change and how it actually worked. One of the things that we did find, particularly around the Race Equality Charter, was that quite often respondents did say that investing in the Race Equality Charter would actually be the result of having a danger of a tick box exercise. And consequently, there was this notion that the whole notion of the Race Equality Charter was itself a performance or an enactment. So it was an example of a performativity, so that universities only addressed these issues because they knew that it would benefit themselves, particularly in relation to the fact that when the process itself was finished and the award was achieved, particularly the Race Equality Charter award, then there was no need for changes to continue. So race had already been dealt with because the university had already achieved the Race Equality Charter Award. And consequently, there was also this need for an institution-wide change. And again, a recognition that this had to continue. So the Race Equality Charter mark should not be seen as a one-off. It should actually be seen as something for an institutional-wide change. There was also an awareness that the kinds of change that were needed were actually structural and indeed institutional, and that deeply embedded examples of microaggressions continue to exist in higher education institutions. And I am aware today, as I speak, of the recent publication of the Commission for Racial and Ethnic Disparities, or the Sewell report, which has argued that they found no evidence of institutional racism. However, I beg to differ. And in this research, there was a huge amount of evidence to show the existence of institutional and structural racism. And our respondents said that these were deeply embedded practices and took place daily through microaggressions. There was also the difficulty of getting the message across, as our respondents spoke about it, because quite often difficult conversations were had to be had around race, and that this included various different difficulties of actually showing that this was an issue and needed to be addressed. So there was a huge difficulty associated with that. And there was also the notion of creating a sense of a universal individual responsibility, which was found to be difficult. So on the one hand, whilst there was examples and a recognition of institutional and structural racism, there was also a difficulty in assessing and actually recognising that individuals also had an individual responsibility to actually address issues of race and racism. So what was really important as well was one of the things we wanted to really kind of think about was this rhetoric and discourse around the institutional responsibility for charter marks and what that actually involved. And we found that the importance of senior level management was hugely important and was seen as crucial, but also had to be very well informed. And again, this was related to this notion of a tick box exercise. And we also found that middle level management was equally important. And what was absolutely interesting and clear from our studies was that quite often in some higher education institutions, the impetus and incentive to go for the Race Equality Charter mark was particularly based on the passion, if you like, or the drive from the Vice Chancellor. So we have 154 higher education institutions in the UK, and not all of them, I've given you the statistics, are members of the Race Equality Charter. And what we found in our studies was that those institutions that were members of the Race Equality Charter, or indeed award holders, were those where the Vice Chancellor him or herself and the senior management team were very passionate and interested in these particular issues. So our argument is actually that every Vice Chancellor and senior management team should be interested in advancing race and equality, rather than just those individual ones who feel that this is an important issue in relation to social justice and equity. And the question of academic and human resources responsibility was particularly complex for the Race Equality Charter because it also included students. So we found that there was this disconnect, if you like, between academics and HR responsibility. So there was this disconnect and also this shifting, if you like, sometimes of responsibility, whether in fact it was the responsibility of the academics or whether in fact it was the responsibility of human resources or professional services to take this forward. And this was particularly complex because it also involved students, and quite often students are not really involved in relation to human resources. So we argue in our research that the Race Equality Charter and race should be a responsibility of everybody. It should be a responsibility of academic staff, professional staff, and HR staff within that. One of the things that also arose was the question of whether to have a designated charter mark person. And this was really interesting because particularly with the Race Equality Charter mark, our research and previous research has found that quite often individuals who take responsibility or are given responsibility for the Race Equality Charter mark tend to be those from Black and minority ethnic backgrounds, because there is an assumption from their colleagues that this is something that they will be interested in, and indeed maybe an assumption that this is something that they have to do. And so quite often the burden for race equality charter mark falls on BME groups. And this is similar in terms of the Athena Swan Charter. Our studies and previous studies have found that quite often the work for Athena Swan Charter the burden falls on women, and they are expected to take responsibility. So within this, we felt that there were some divergent views around these particular issues. So some individuals felt that a designated role was essential, whereas others felt that actually, if this happened, particularly if it was around race and it would go to a BME person, some felt that it actually dismissed the collective responsibility of the fact that it should be a holistic, institution-wide responsibility rather than an individual one. And in practice, actually, we found that what happened, the process of the Race Equality Charter mark and also the Athena Swan was often driven by indeed one or several people. And again, that takes me back to my first point on this slide, that this often came from the top, from a vice chancellor who was hugely invested in these particular issues, where he or she would identify individuals that they also knew were invested. And I think that there is a real danger if this happens and continues to happen, because, as I've already said, race equality work, and indeed particularly in terms of advancing race equality, should be everybody's responsibility. So I just want to move on to workload issues and the application process itself, particularly in terms of the huge amount of workload that goes on in submitting an application, both for the Athena Swan and indeed race equality. So our respondents told us about the hugely demanding work around the administrative time process, and also some of which they actually felt was hugely unnecessary. And one of the things that I will say about workload issues in terms of these charter marks is quite often what happens is that and this is what we found in our research, is that this work goes unrecognised. It's not rewarded in any way. It's certainly not rewarded in terms of the ref. It's not refable. And secondly, there's often not ring-fenced funding to progress the work. So what happens is individuals have to carry out this work in addition to their day job. So it was hugely demanding, the application process, and some of those demands included access to institutional data. And this varied. For instance, there was a variety across our sample of the way in which data around race and gender was recorded. And there were examples of very good practice, actually excellent practice, but also examples of very bad practice. And in some cases where the bad practice existed, this required a huge amount of work in terms of actually gaining and having access to that data, which would be beneficial in terms of submitting the application. And again, I've already said that there was an overrepresentation of women and BME staff in charter mark work, and this has been shown by previous research, and it's already noted in terms of the Athena Swan, but we also found that this is exactly the case in terms of the Race Equality Charter mark. So there was no recognition of charter mark workload issues within the models, and this was inconsistent across and within higher education institutions in our sample. And this was particularly unclear in Race Equality Charter mark work. I will say here that Athena Swan Charter work was actually much clearer in terms of accessing it and relating it to workload models, but this was not the case in relation to the Race Equality Charter mark work. And we argue that this is because race is not seen as important as gender, and race is always given a secondary priority. And this was absolutely evident in all of the processes in terms of the respondents that we spoke to and the data that we actually looked at. And finally, in terms of workload issues, there was a lot of emotional labour that took place, particularly in terms of the unrecognised impact of charter mark work. So self-assessment team members were often talked about very actually deeply depressing accounts of lived experiences that they had to listen to, particularly around issues around racism and race. And so the emotional labour that also went on in relation to the Race Equality Charter mark, and indeed the Athena Swan, was often unrecognised by senior managers. So I think that this is something that really needs to be thought about in terms of taking these issues forward. So how do we talk about gender versus race? So one of the things that we found in our studies, which was really important, was there was this notion of the difficulty of managing both the charter marks at once. For example, what happened was the experiences of the Athena Swan Charter often increased a reluctance to begin race equality charter work at the same time. And what I want to do now is I want to read some quotes in relation to what some of our respondents actually said around these particular issues. So, for instance, one responder, who was a white female, said, "Oh, but I do wonder, given, for instance, the Animal Sciences Institute has taken the Athena Swan forward so seriously, and they have improved life for everybody. And they're always talking about the Athena Swan Charter. I'm actually starting to wonder, why should we actually have a race equality charter mark? Because we don't need it. We've already got the Athena Swan Charter mark, and the Athena Swan Charter mark talks about intersectionality, doesn't it? So why should we have another charter?" And I will also read another quote, which I think is very pertinent in terms of looking at these ideas of gender versus race. I think that there's a lot to say about the Athena Swan Charter, and I think it's good to have a conversation around gender, but it's more difficult to have a conversation about race, because what we try and do is, when we talk about race, we forget about other issues, and we forget about the fact that gender has always been an inequality in higher education. So some people will say that, OK, we talk about gender and we consider things like childcare responsibilities, and childcare and family responsibilities also apply to BME women. So why do we need a race equality charter mark? We don't need it. We've got the Athena Swan Charter because that also includes BME women. And then I'll go on and read one last quote and carry on with the slide. We can actually say that generally a lot of our protected characteristics are very good, and they are actually dealt with. You know, we do have to think about other things. It's not just about race. We have to think about religion. We have to think about sexual orientation, and and disability, and we can't think that we have to forget about those issues and think about race. What about our disabled staff who are clearly not happy? What about our staff who are trans? They're not happy. It does grate on me slightly that we're doing all this stuff for BME people, but nothing for these other groups who continue to be forgotten about. So this is what was particularly interesting about our study, was this notion of competing identities and competing inequalities, and it's what I call a hierarchy of oppression. So what we found in our study was there was this difficulty with people understanding and accepting that we needed a different charter mark to focus specifically on race. And the thing that they kept going back to was the fact that the Athena Swan Charter had intersectionality within it. So the Athena Swan Charter already addressed race. So this problem of competing inequalities was that the Race Equality Charter process often led to questions about which other inequalities should be addressed. And I think that last quote that I read out was absolutely demonstrated that in an excellent way. And then respondents also talked about the possibility of having a single equalities charter mark, and there were diverging views on this, because there was either this notion that a single equalities mark would actually increase efficiency, so all the inequalities were in one particular place. But others argued, however, that what would happen is a single equalities mark would actually make race secondary yet again, as we have seen and discussed previously. And a key issue that also arose, which was very interesting, was geographical location. So there was a consistent rationale in our studies from individuals saying that they did not need to did not need to actually not just include the Race Equality Charter itself, but to have conversations around race, because they were located in universities or geographical locations where there were few BME people. And I just want to read a couple of quotes on that, which I think are really interesting. So in terms of a single Equalities Charter mark, one person said, "I think that we could have one submission, because a lot of the recommendations you make around gender equality actually apply to race as well. So yeah, get the data, bring it all together and put it into one submission. And that way we'll have one equality submission rather than having the Race Equality Charter mark. You could call it an equalities mark, especially if we're going down the lines of intersectionality. Perhaps we also need to look at our wider equality credentials that we have in our universities and see what we're doing as well. So I do think that there's definitely scope to look at the whole thing and put in one equalities submission rather than having a Race Equality Charter mark. And I just want to reread the bit on this quote, which says that a lot of the recommendations you make about gender equality actually apply equally to race as well. And I'll leave you to think about that quote yourselves. And I want to read a couple of quotes around geographical location, which I think are very interesting in terms of looking at geography. So when I looked at the results of the race equality data analysis, I thought to myself, I know obviously we have a university benchmark and we have our business case in terms of how we should be taking race forward. But at the same time, I think we've also got to consider where we are positioned. We're not an inner London university. Our campuses are not ethnically diverse. They are not ethnically diverse places. So there's some relativity to that. So why should we think about having the Race Equality Charter mark when we don't have an ethnically diverse campus? And another quote I would just like to say in relation to that, and then I will continue, is on different applications in terms of the meaning of the Race Equality Charter mark in different institutions, I think that's actually going to be very different. So if you've got a city like ours and you look at its racial composition, that's going to be very different to somewhere like Bradford or Birmingham or London or wherever. And so our goal is going to be very different. Whereas pretty much everywhere has the same proportion of men and women. So therefore, that's a really important challenge. So we don't need to have the Race Equality Charter mark. We only need to think about the proportions of men and women because we know that that is going to exist everywhere. So I'm conscious of time and this is my last slide. So what we found in our study was that there was a precedence of gender over race, and we argue that white women are and have been the main beneficiaries of higher education policy, specifically in relation to the Athena Swan Charter. And we also found in our studies that there was a danger of gender and race work becoming conflated in equalities work. So what we found, and as I think I've demonstrated this from the quotes, that universities said that they were engaged in equality and diversity work. And consequently, what happened was gender always took precedence in equalities work and race was always given a secondary priority. So in effect, equalities work meant gender. So this logic of efficiency drives higher education institutions to privilege gender over race, because they state that if we look at gender within equalities work, this is more efficient for us as an organisation. Excuse me, and it exists for our business case in taking it forward. Consequently, higher education institutions publicly work towards equality and inclusion in general terms, i.e. prioritising gender rather than specific terms, thereby ignoring race. Higher education institutions are able to do this, we argue, without confronting deeply embedded practices based on white privilege and the ways in which white privilege works in higher education institutions, because higher education institutions are examples of white privilege in which they work to perpetuate and reinforce that whiteness. So consequently, we argue that higher education institutions would only invest in the Race Equality Charter if it benefits them. They will only invest in the Race Equality Charter because they can sell themselves as fair and diverse to parents and students who are paying £9,500 a year to study at their institutions. So higher education institutions only benefit from the Race Equality Charter and invest in it because it works only for them rather than advancing race equality. And that's my book, Quite Privileged, and I've finished now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kalwant. That's really fantastic, very stimulating and provocative presentation. So just remind everyone that there is an opportunity to participate in the Q&A by just going to on the right-hand side of your screen. You should have an opportunity to, on the portal there, you should have an opportunity to put through some questions. There's one that's come through, which is basically, Kalwant, you mentioned about a designated role or a designated leadership role, and if that the risks and dangers of that falling to a member of a minority ethnic community or whatever in relation to the race equality work. The question is kind of suggesting that there are also risks or dangers if that were to be given to a white person, for example, and it might be, people might complain that that's kind of, a performative kind of gesture or something. So do you want to just say something about, how you see that kind of issue more broadly in terms of collaboration, perhaps among colleagues from different backgrounds and so on, and what works best from your point of view?
That's a really good question and a really good point. I think that, so for instance, in our research, we found that there was an assumption that BME individuals would actually take on this role from their white colleagues. So there was an assumption that they would be interested in race. There would be an assumption that they would take on the workload. So I think that we have to be really careful in terms of how those workload allocations take place. So some of our respondents did say that they would want somebody who had an understanding of race to take on that role. But what the point that I was making in the talk was that it should not be assumed that this is the case. And it needs to be, as you've said, a collaborative process. So if you have Race Equality Charter teams, self-assessment teams, they should not comprise all BME academics or professional staff. They should represent the community that they serve. They should represent higher education. So I think it's having a balance, but also being sensitive and mindful to what the role means, and also to understand that, and this is what our respondents told us, that you have to understand the lived experiences of racism that academics, students and staff experience in higher education institutions. So therefore, you need somebody who can understand that and take that on board and not dismiss those as, for instance, my research has shown, a clash of personalities and an acknowledgement that racism exists, because as I've said before, a failure to acknowledge results in a failure to act.
Okay, great. So we have a question here about some of the challenges that we face, obviously, are very deeply ingrained in people's thinking and so on. So they actually, their roots are embedded in people before they get to university. So for both sexism, racism and so on. Is there anything that you have to say about how universities might engage with kind of earlier sectors in the education system in order to try and further this work?
Okay, so I think that we need to take a couple of steps back in terms of secondary education and primary education. And I think this is kind of like looking at it holistically, particularly around what we are teaching, what history we are teaching young people in our schools and our colleges, because sometimes I think that once we get students into HE, it's almost too late in terms of what we're teaching them. And those students then become academics. And so they are brought up with history that doesn't recognise imperialism and colonialism and the oppressiveness of that. And so I think we need to think about that. And secondly, I think and this is probably going to be controversial given the recent publication of the Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities report, is that we do need training that is good, effective, and that works in universities, and that training, call it, you know, unconscious bias training or other diversity and equality training, has to address white privilege, microaggressions, and how that continues to work. And quite often this means having difficult conversations and challenging conversations that actually I think have to be had.
Okay, there is a question, and it was one that I would have asked you as well. It's just in relation to the concept of white privilege, and obviously with, you mentioned the Sewell report and so on. I mean, how do we motivate more white colleagues to get involved in that work if they can point to something like the Sewell report and kind of basically deny, if you like, white privilege, the existence of white privilege? Yeah, so can you just add a little bit more, just within a university context and so on, about, it's really about motivating more white staff to become engaged in this work in that wider context that we've noted?
I think that's a really excellent question, actually, given that we have had the publication of this report. So there's a huge amount of evidence, you know, that identifies institutional racism. There's a huge amount of evidence and research that talks about white privilege. And I would recommend my colleagues to go and read about these, you know, really respected articles and academic articles and reports. But also, I think it's important to have conversations with our colleagues, to sit down and talk about how white privilege works and how intersectionality within that works. For instance, how class, race and gender work, and why it's needed. Those conversations are needed, and they may be uncomfortable, and it may well be, you know, that the university perhaps sets up groups where these conversations through the diversity and equality departments, where they can sit down and have these conversations around white privilege to be better informed about the evidence that actually exists, rather than, you know, a report which we knew, we were well aware what those findings of that report were going to be, because there was evidence and hints of it, with Kim Badenoch in the House of Commons denouncing the use of critical race theory. Okay, so does that mean I can't teach Marxism? Does that mean I can't teach Bourdieu? Why is critical race theory attacked? And Trump attacked critical race theory. And then the letter that Tony Sewell, the chair of the commission, wrote in December to Kim Badenoch, which there were hints in there that it was all going to be about geography. It was a deficit model. It was going to blame the individual. So, you know, we have to be very cautious also in terms of how we read statistics and how they are interpreted.
Yeah, okay. I mean, I think it's obviously bounced a lot of those of us committed to this work to dig out and to make sure we're communicating very effectively about the existing evidence which is out there of the systematic and pervasive racism which is across society. There's a question about funding and whether or not we can really make real progress in this unless there's dedicated kind of funding. Did you find in the research that you were doing, in fact, either about the REC work or Athena Swan, that was a key variable in terms of measures of success, or the way in which institutions embraced the work?
Yeah, definitely. And that's a really good question, because what we found was that those institutions that were committed and that were successful had a lot of ring-fenced funding allocated to the Athena Swan Charter or the Race Equality Charter. So there was a clear investment from senior managers to have this ring-fence funding, and also, and again I did talk about this quite a lot, that there was an investment in terms of the workload model. So there was a recognition from senior managers that actually, you know, you need hours for the work that you're putting into this. You need money set aside to ensure, and those were the ones that were successful. But again, it'll take me back to the slide that I talked about senior managers. Often the ones that took this seriously were those where vice chancellors, pro-vice chancellors and the senior management team really felt as though this was an important issue. So again, I mean, the statistics are there. We have 154 higher education institutions, and only a small number of those are members, let alone holders of the Race Equality Charter. So that, I think, tells a story in itself, that we feel that every vice chancellor and senior management should be invested in this and have funding available. And those universities that didn't have funding, that didn't have workload allocation, we felt were not really that interested in this issue and felt that they perhaps were doing it as a tick box exercise.
Okay, there's a comment and question related to, you said earlier that there were some ways or some views certainly that equality issues in relation to race and gender had similarities and that there could be things that they had in common. But I think you also at other times suggested that there were important differences that had to be recognised. So do you want to just elaborate on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, so that was the quote that I read from one of the respondents that said that. It wasn't the research team that said that. So what was really interesting, and they were all white respondents that said this, was that there was this kind of lack of acknowledgement that racism and race and ethnic identity didn't really matter because gender and race had similar outcomes. So the example that respondent gave was childcare. So, and we have equal numbers of men and women. So why should we actually focus on race? So of course, there are similarities when we look at things like childcare for women and flexi working, etc., etc. But I think that actually missed the point. We argue in our study that misses the point because this is about race. We're not talking about gender, we're talking about race. So that quote is another example, an excellent example of race and racism being dismissed and taken secondary priority. And then the other quote that I read out was about the white woman who said about disability and trans, etc. So again, she was missing the point. The point is that we are talking about race. Let us talk about race. We're not talking about other inequalities.
Okay, there's a question from a colleague involved in initial teacher education, and it's really about the kind of curriculum and making sure that student teachers are engaged in, aware of anti-racist work and ways of decolonising their curriculum and so on. And of course, at universities, not least here at Keele, we're engaging in a fairly systematic project across all subject areas in decolonising the curriculum. Do you want to, have you got kind of views that you want to share on the importance of that work or how you see it actually impacting on some of these other key elements and measures of inequality, race-based inequality?
So I think that's a really good question and a very, very interesting point. And I'll repeat myself a little bit here, is again, we do need to think about what our young people are taught in schools, and that's a good question in terms of ITE in primary and secondary schools. And I think that it's really important that young people are given an honest and open account of issues of imperialism and colonialism. And at universities, we must also be training our teachers to ensure that they are including all of these aspects. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about that report again, is they mentioned Britishness in the report quite a lot, actually. And I think that there is no definition of what Britishness means. And there's a huge amount of evidence to show the problems associated with that term anyway, particularly in relation to whiteness. So I think and also citizenship, actually. So we need to think about what we are teaching and how we are decolonising. I mean, that's a word that, isn't it, that's often used, our own curriculum in terms of what we are teaching our students. But also, I think one of the things that's lacking is that we're not preparing our trainee teachers to understand how to deal with racism and how race is a factor in schools. And I think we do need to do that. And I think that's something we're not doing in terms of trainee teachers. And there's a huge amount of evidence to show that when BME teachers themselves go into schools, they also experience racism. And the school workforce statistics are the same, excuse me, as the HE statistics. So the higher up you go, so head teachers are more likely to be white and male, which is similar to
Okay, there's also a question about colleagues from our students from Black minority ethnic backgrounds progressing on to higher degrees to PhDs in particular, and the kind of leaky pipeline there and so on, the lack of perhaps due to racism, trauma or discrimination through the system and so on. Again, is there anything that you've found in the research that relates specifically to positive actions that have been taken in relation to ensuring greater progression, more proportional progression, at least through to PhD, for example.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because what the statistics tell us, first of all, is the rate of progression from undergraduate to postgraduate to master's degrees is higher for black BME students than it is for white students. But the rate of progression to PhDs is lower for BME students. And what my research has found that this is quite often due to the lack of access to economic capital. So quite often PhDs are either self-funded or based on ESRC or other scholarships, and those are very few and far between. So there is an inequality there in terms of access to economic capital. And some good practice that we found in our research, and also some things that have actually been developed recently, is that many universities are specifically now and have been introducing scholarships specifically for BME students to do PhDs. And I think that's an excellent way forward. And of course, you know, every time we say these things, you're accused of lowering standards. We're not talking about lowering standards. We're talking about making the PhD market much more representative and diverse, which it isn't at the moment. And there's a huge amount of evidence to show that those decisions that young people make in their third year of their undergraduate degree have a huge impact in terms of social mobility, access to the labour market and future life chances. And the more BME students we have progressing onto PhD, the more diverse our labour market will be.
Okay, but Kalwant, there's another question which touches on another controversial element of the Sewell report, and that's about the term BME or BAME. And you did open your talk by acknowledging the contested and problematic nature of that term, and this is something we've debated in our own RecSat here. I suppose for me, and this is going beyond what the questioner asked, but you know, have you given any thought to a suitable alternative, or whether there is a better way to speak about, obviously given the danger of homogenization and so on, which is implicit in the term?
So look, that's again a really good question. So I think that what the Sewell report has done is it's taken us back full circle. Okay, now I'm old enough to remember when the term ethnic minority was introduced. So what they use in that report is the term ethnic minority, which takes us back to the 80s, or if not before. So that in itself is really interesting. Now, look, I've been asked about this several times. Terminology to me is neither here nor there. OK, because those of us working in this area, whether we use the term BME or BAME or ethnic minority, we are well aware that this is not a homogenous category, number one. Number two, there are differences within and between. And number three, we disaggregate the term. We disaggregate it when we present our findings. We say Asian Indian, Asian Pakistani, Asian Bangladeshi, Black African, Black Caribbean. So that, I think, I don't know why that's in the report, but it's neither here or there, because what's more important to me is that we define our terms, we make it clear that the terms that we're using, we don't homogenize, and that we disaggregate that term. And what's more important to me is how we advance racial equality rather than having conversations and quibbles about the terms that we're using. Okay,
thanks. So a question now about, you know, the risks, is I think the way you presented it about the possibility of, let's say, one charter mark that covered all protected characteristics or all challenges regarding equality. Do you want to just elaborate a bit further on what the risks are there, specifically in relation to advancing race equality, which I think was part of the point you made?
Yeah, so quite a few of our respondents, and again, they were all white, said that really, and I think that they were kind of relating this in terms of the workload issue and the amount of work that has to take, as we all know, who have been involved in these charter marks, the amount of work that's invested in putting an application forward. So the justification for an equalities charter mark was that gender could be seen in race because, for instance, as I've already said, that if you were looking at childcare, etc., and the inequalities themselves could be seen to be in one charter mark because of intersectionality. So if you include intersectionality, and I know that intersectionality is a buzzword of late, but if you include it to ensure that race, class, gender, disability, then you only have one single equalities mark. But we argued in our research that if that happens, then the same thing will happen where race, will be given a secondary priority. So as I've argued in my talk, that gender has always been given precedence over race in higher education policy making. There's a history of it, and it's also the case in historically feminism. Feminism was only concerned with the experiences of white women, white middle class women. So the danger was that, again, other inequalities would take priority over race. So race would be seen at the back of the queue. So that was the pros and the cons for it.
Okay, so there's a questioner who is, it's another question about terminology, but important terminology around the term white privilege, I guess. So this questioner thinks that the term sometimes is misunderstood by people. So when it's been brought up in discussion, they think it's associated with wealth and high income and so on. So poor white people are less advantaged. White people just can't see themselves in anywhere, struggle to see how they are privileged in this regard. So do you have a response to that one?
So white privilege as a concept was introduced by Peggy McIntosh back in the 80s, and of course has been written about by critical race theorists and other theorists. So white privilege, she defines it as an invisible knapsack that individuals have on their back, and in that invisible knapsack is access to a passport, to blank checks, to certain things that black people would not have. So for instance, white privilege means that you can park your car and not be stopped by the police. White privilege means you can walk through customs and not be stopped by the police. White privilege means that you can use a restroom in a coffee shop and not be arrested. So I argue in my work that there are different shades of whiteness. There's acceptable and unacceptable, legitimate and illegitimate forms of whiteness. So, for example, Gypsies and Travellers, who define themselves as white in my research, although they are white, they do not have those privileges afforded to white middle class identity. So as a concept, I actually, of course, it's a useful concept. I've written a book on it, and I will continue to use it despite what the Sewell report says about it as well. And I think it again, as I've said, in terms of conceptual and discourse and narratives that we use, we must define our terms and be clear how we are using them and think about the nuances rather than, excuse the pun, black and white.
Okay, it's just about out of time, but there's one last question I just want to put to you. It's a very practical one. So it's about really how we could maybe take benefits from those institutions like Keele that has a race equality charter award. Should we be pressing for, let's say, research funding allocation to be limited to only those universities that have such an award? Well, in terms, we've had that kind of debate about Athena Swan and certain funding bodies. So yeah, just your views on that one would be good before we finish.
So I would like to say that I think the Race Equality Charter mark should absolutely be linked to funding, because when it was announced that the Athena Swan Charter was going to be linked to funding, the number of applications increased by 400% in 1 week. So money doesn't scream, money doesn't talk, it screams. So absolutely, the Race Equality Charter mark should be linked to research funding. And you can bet that every institution will sign up to it. But again, then that makes me think about, will it just be a tick box exercise rather than thinking about advancing race equality?
Indeed. Well, it wouldn't be I mean, there are a lot of other reasons that I think institutions do sign up to it. Obviously, you emphasised in your talk some of the more instrumentalist and cynical reasons. But I mean, I think for a lot of us involved in the work, there is also a lot of sincerity and genuine. But sincerity, as we've said, isn't enough. We have to be practical. We have to actually act to make a difference. But I think just on behalf of all those present, I just want to thank you again, Kalwant, for a really stimulating lecture on a really important and topical issue for all of us who are committed to transforming our institutions to achieve greater degrees of equality. So thank you so much for that. Thanks also to those who helped with the smooth running of the event. Shiva Sikdar, who's the coordination of our Race Equality Lecture Series, Sally Bishop in our events and conference team, Dan, Dave and Jake in our AVS team, and Steve Kilner, who organised this from the Institute for Liberal Arts and Sciences. And of course, thanks very much to you, the audience, for your support and contributions to the Grand Challenge Lecture Series. And as always, some great questions. Just before I let you all go, just to as we normally do, just remind everyone of our next event. So our next event at ILAS is the annual Keele Postgraduate Conference in partnership with the Keele Doctoral Academy. represents a great opportunity to celebrate fantastic range and diversity of postgraduate work across the university, and it includes a virtual poster gallery, online voting on the day. It has the popular 3-minute thesis competition and a chance for students to advertise their research, and the Open Research Award and panel discussions, breakout discussions, and so on. So it'll be a fantastic event. So the conference is going to take place on Teams Tuesday the 8th of June from 9:15. So full details on how to register are available on the ILAS website. So that is my final thanks. So many thanks again, Kalwant, and thanks to everybody else for attending and hopefully enjoying the event. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.